Hi everybody. Ready to welcome you to our member open house this month. And we do these occasionally to present topics and guests to our members that they might find interesting and informative. Today, we have the honor of speaking with press photographer Ben Norman, who's also a member. So we're super excited about that. And I also just want to go ahead and do some quick introductions with the people that we're speaking with. Ben Norman is a press, editorial, and commercial photographer that has been with Wonderful Machine for 12 years next month. Thank you, Ben. His clients include the New York Times for over 700 assignments, Time, Vanity Fair, New York Magazine, ACLU, Newsweek, AARP, Sports Illustrated, The Wall Street Journal, Time Out New York, Under Armour, IBM, Johnson & Johnson, and so much more. His accomplishments and accolades also include a Telly Award for cinematography, team producer for Eddie Adams Workshop, New York Photo Awards winner. His work and books include Harlem, A Century in Images, Obama, The Historic Campaign and Photographs, Like a Gallery, New York. Ben lives in New York City with his wife and their soon-to-be-born twins in August. Super exciting. And I also want to introduce Brian Sheffield, in case you haven't met him yet. He's one of our senior producers. He works with photographers and clients every day, consulting on project estimates, appropriate creative licensing fees, agreement negotiating, and shoot production and execution all over the world. Brian lives in the Philly suburbs with his theater executive wife, their 2 children, and 2 dogs. And I'm Marianne Lee. I'm one of our project managers and a marketing specialist. I'm one of the marketing consultants here, and I work with between 10 to 12 photographers a month, helping them reach new clients. I live in Rhode Island, the land of quahogs and sailing. And with that, we'll just talk a little bit about our conversation today. We're going to do this in 3 parts. We're going to do an overview of Ben and his work, and then we'll do an overview of Ben's recent project with the New York Times covering the Trump indictment. And then lastly, we'll cover just general working as a press photographer. We'll talk a little bit about copyright, fees, and how to stay relevant as a press photographer. We'd love your input along the way, so feel free to drop comments and questions in the chat. We may save the questions till the end, depending on timing, but I'll be keeping an eye on those, and we'll definitely get to as many as we can. I'm going to go ahead and let Brian and Ben take it from here.
Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. Yeah, Ben and I have been working together a bunch over the last month, pretty much talking every single day on a couple different projects. And, we started passing around the idea of putting together one of these member open houses, which I think is super exciting since we haven't done this in quite a bit of time. The most notable thing I think lately that came to our attention was that Ben was instrumental part for the New York Times in the Trump indictment coverage, so which we're excited to talk about today. Some good storytelling. But first, I imagine everyone can see my screen. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Good. So it'd just be good to start at the start and go over Ben as a photographer. I'm going to walk through a couple slides here, and Ben, would you help narrate them?
Yeah, of course.
Awesome.
All right, so this first one, this was actually my first A1 for the New York Times. I think it was back in 2016 or 17. They were doing a very data-based story on how to measure subway ridership and how late the trains were. So they asked me to illustrate an image for this. So this was taken with a monopod, 3 foot above my head with a remote, trying to be inconspicuous in the New York City subway.
And you said A1.
Yeah, so that was my first above the fold front page New York Times photograph, basically, this one.
Okay, great. And I imagine going into the assignment, did you know that was going to be the placement?
No, I had no idea. I knew once you see, when you get sometimes you get a draft of an article, and if you see more than one reporter on it, it's a good chance it's going to be a bigger story. So this one had 3 reporters on it. So I definitely went the extra mile to potentially get them an A1 image, and it paid off.
That's good to know.
This was a story about historic LGBT sites around the city, and this was in Chelsea. It's one of the first LGBTQ-friendly churches in Chelsea. So I got to hang out with the pastor, who's in the middle of the frame, hugging the man, and this was right after Mass.
Okay. So for this story, this came through New York Times. Who was in charge of getting you locations and clearances and the, access and times and everything? Was that the editors, or was some of that responsibility put on you?
Yeah, the access was from the photo editors, but everything after I walked in the door was on me, basically. So how long I spend there, what images to consider, everything like that was my decision.
That's great. I imagine in something like this, that might be a little sensitive. The church put out a note to their congregation potentially in advance saying, "Hey, we got New York Times coming."
Exactly. Yeah. And then I think at the beginning of the mass, if I remember correctly, I introduced myself, and if anybody was uncomfortable having their image shown for any reason, they would raise their hand. So that was a big consideration as well.
That's good. I imagine it's the opposite probably in some of these situations you're in, where people want to be photographed and, act up in order to be photographed.
Brian, you nailed it. It's I always like to joke that when you say you're coming with the New York Times, they either roll out the red carpet or slam the door in your face. So really, it's usually one or the other. Yeah.
Very cool. Tell us about these assignments.
Yeah, so the top left image, was actually the left side images were both taken during COVID. Those were images that I found on my own, just while being basically a scout photographer for the New York Times. They would send us out, because we're photographers, we can't do our job on the phone. They would send us out to different neighborhoods to just kind of get a pulse of the city. These were both taken in April of 2020. And the one on the top left is just a man doing his midday prayer in the back of his box truck in deep in Brooklyn. And then the bottom left is actually a bar mitzvah that was held outside in a very conservative Jewish neighborhood of Brooklyn called Borough Hall. So with that, I actually stumbled upon that bar mitzvah, and they let me photograph.
Yeah, one of the in prep for this, one of the stories Ben was telling me was that the outdoor bar mitzvah was you described it best as one of the happiest scenes you'd seen during COVID.
It was, and it was, there's a lot of considerations in place in terms of how to portray certain communities. So I wanted to find a story, especially from the Jewish community, that was maybe not all doom and gloom. So I got very lucky with this opportunity to be led onto the street to photograph this scene when COVID was still, this was April, so it was still very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. And remind me too, it's probably more appropriate to talk about at the end, but during COVID, I want to talk about hazard pay, and I want to talk about day rate as you going out as like a scout too.
For sure.
Let's chat about that. What about the bottom right, this outdoor?
Yeah, the bottom right was actually a lovely opportunity. Is for the dining section of the New York Times. That's John Batiste. He's currently Stephen Colbert's band leader and is now becoming he's a very prominent jazz musician himself. He comes from a legendary New Orleans jazz family. This was actually a second line, so it was sort of what they do in New Orleans for funerals, but it was a second line that he hosted from one restaurant to another restaurant in Manhattan. And if you could see, I don't think he's in the image, but the artist JR, the very famous visual artist JR, was just in my way before I took this photo. So I had the displeasure of asking JR to get out of my way so I could capture this image. And there's also there's one of the DMC's, I'm sorry, Run DMC's daughters at far left in the image. She's smiling with the black shirt on too. So
very cool.
That's great.
Very cool.
Yeah, this image is also from, I want to say 2018 or 19. This was a former Marine and FDNY firefighter who was killed battling a fire in the city. And this was taken right outside of Fifth Avenue off one of the major cathedrals on Fifth Avenue. So I was on a riser across the street with fellow members of the press taking this image, and that's the victim's family.
Jesus, and that eldest daughter just reaching out for the helmet. That's brutal.
Yeah, and this was, I got to say, this was also an A1 picture. So this ran above the fold the next day, and I was very proud of that because, the New York Times is such an international paper nowadays. It's very hard to get a local image to run so prominently. So I was very proud and happy that they featured a local image in a very serious and very moving scene.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to capture this too. I mean, I'm understanding it looks around Easter by the youngest girl holding that Easter egg, but just the matching dresses and matching cardigans. And, like I mentioned, that eldest girl reaching out, and then that firefighter on stage right of the widow looking at the helmet. That's brutal.
It was brutal. It was a rainy day. I mean, the weather matched the atmosphere. It was a very somber day, of course. But I was happy that this was brought to attention for sure. It's very important.
Yeah. And for this one, did you know it was going to be A1 before you went out there?
No, I was actually pretty surprised, I got to say. I forget, there was something else going on in the world that day that was also pretty big breaking news, but I was very proud that the editors chose to keep it local and to focus on this scene. But I had absolutely no idea.
Mm-hmm. And in a situation like that, when do you find out? After it runs, or do they give you a heads up at all?
Sometimes you get a notification the night before, but I believe I woke up and found out this news.
Hmm.
All right, so this is some more of my fun assignments for the New York Times. The top left is a bar called Paris Blues in Harlem. I actually photographed that bar on my birthday, which was very convenient because I turned in the pictures and then stayed at the bar for the rest of the night. It's a very famous bar in Harlem. The name is Sam Hargress Jr. The one on the top right is a gentleman, a Puerto Rican artist named Juan Figueroa, and he is standing on the Washington Square Arch in that photograph. And he's quite literally called the living statue. So he would just pose there for up to an hour at a time.
Wow.
Story on him. The bottom of the photograph was one of the first stories I pitched in the New York Times. It was about the unofficial cheerleading squad of the New York Giants, the football team. They very proudly don't have cheerleaders, but there's a group of ex-college and professional cheerleaders that are trying to make their way in with the franchise. So I spent 2 or 3 days covering them. And in the bottom right is a New Orleans Mardi Gras Indian performing in the middle of the street.
Was that up here in New York?
The one in the bottom right was in New Orleans.
No, it's cool.
Yeah.
Very good. So the all 4 of these images have a very light cascading across the scene left to right vibe. Talk to me about the upper left. Did you have any additional lighting in there?
No, he was that was Sammy's favorite bar seat. It would happen to be about only 15 feet from the door or so. So I was able to get just a little bit of the door light trickling in with that natural light. And I did have to edit it. I did bring down the background around him to bring him out a little bit, but otherwise that was natural. And I'm very proud to say I didn't even have to pose him with that. That's how I literally came back into the bar. He was in that pose, and I just said, "Sammy, look at me," and I ripped a couple photos.
That's great. I love it.
Yes, this is one of my favorite assignments in ever. I've done this for the last 6 or 7 years for the New York Times. I call it the best day in New York. It's the New York City Marathon. And I'm very lucky that I've been able to cover it from the Verrazano Bridge, which connects Staten Island and Brooklyn. So this is about mile 1 or 2 or the very beginning of the race. They only allow about 5 or 6 photographers on the bridge, mainly for security reasons, especially after the Boston Marathon bombing security got very tight. They actually used to let photographers onto the pillars. So if you look at the very center of the frame, you used to be able to climb all the way up to the top of the bridge to take photographs, but they did away with that. It's a great position to shoot the marathon because it's only the first mile or 2, so everybody's in a great mood. Everybody's still packed together, and it's a really unique experience. And I shot this with a tilt shift lens. I think a 45mm tilt shift lens.
Mm-hmm. This is probably a good example of people hooting and hollering, trying to get your attention to be in frame.
Yes, this is one of the probably only days of the year where I don't fight it because it's almost impossible to fight. They kind of think that you're either a photographer from the marathon or they know you're from the press and they want to get their face in the paper. But it's such a happy day for the city that we usually oblige. But the number of notes I've gotten about sending them photos, I've gotten probably 100 or 200 notes over the last years of people who see me see themselves in my photograph and want a copy. And I'm always happy to oblige. But it's a very special day.
Yeah, that's great. Probably nice to be there at the beginning of the race too, when people are still at their peak performance and not
exactly
messes yet.
Exactly. Yep.
It's fun.
There's a good question in the chat about Tegra is interested in how many stories are you pitching versus how many stories are assigned?
Great question. So since in 2016, I went to the Missouri Photo Workshop, which is a very well-known photojournalism and documentary workshop. And they helped me refine my pitching. So since then, I've tried to pitch every year 1 to 3 major stories, multi-day stories that involve a lot of reporting and producing and access granting. That'll take me anywhere from 1 week to a month or 2 to complete. It's the percentage is low of pitched versus assigned stories, but the pitch stories are a heavy lift. So they usually are multi-day or multi-week affairs.
And to be clear, these stories you're pitching are things that are not photographed yet. It's just more of like, here's
they are almost not photographed yet. I usually come with some sort of access, and I know we're going to talk about pitching later, but no photographs really have been taken yet. If anything, I'll take 1 or 2 example photos just to show them what I'm thinking about for their project, but for the most part, no.
Okay. Very cool. This photo was in the deck before I saw the title, and I was intrigued right away.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories that I've ever shot. This was a group of artists who turned a water tower in Chelsea above an abandoned building into a speakeasy, and they did 2 rounds of it. The first time it was just a little bar and table setups, but this one, which was taken on Valentine's Day a couple of years ago, they turned it into a hot tub, and they literally siphoned water from another water tower across the way into this water tower to heat it up and serve people. And it was one of those things where, it was invite only and very exclusive or whatever. And this was actually an interesting legal consideration because we agreed with the subjects that we wouldn't run the pictures until after they had shut down the speakeasy because it was quite illegal. So we had to hold on to these pictures until they finished up their run of show, basically. And a funny tidbit about this image is that I brought my wife as an assistant for this job. So she's in the hot tub and she's sitting next to Edward Norton and his Edward Norton's partner at the time. And they are, if you look at the bottom center of the frame, if you follow the ladder down, the first gentleman to the right is Edward Norton. So if you go down a little bit more, keep going down, and then go to the right a little bit.
Right.
That couple, that's Edward Norton and his partner at the time, and my wife is in the fur hat right next to them, hanging out.
Oh, awesome! I love it.
Yeah.
Indoor fur hat. That's great.
Yeah.
I love this propane tank with all these candles, super sketchy, and this just hint of like saxophone going on here.
Yep, and it was so cold that we actually got iced out, so water spilled out into where you would enter the water tower, which was through the bottom. So we had to at about 2 a.m, the people that ran it had to send somebody out the top of the water tower down and use an ice pick to get us all out of there. So it became a little harrowing for a minute.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
And this dude looks like a 1940s private investigator,
and he's one of the organizers. Exactly. ND Austin is his name. Yep.
Very cool. Nothing to do with this presentation, but what kind of drinks were being served there?
Great question. It was all batch cocktails. I kept it very light because I had 2 cameras in my hand, and it was a very tenuous, walking experience as well. I was by far the most sober person in that water tower, but it was a lot of Negronis, a lot of stuff like that for sure.
I love it.
So there is a good question in the chat about how does the time think about the degree to which image manipulation is acceptable, both in terms of your direction and your subjects, and also digitally dodging and burning afterwards. So I suppose that could be included in the don't publish the photos until after the illegal event as well. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've heard a lot. I've talked about a lot with my colleagues. When I started working for the Times in 2008 or 9, the directive we were given was don't do anything in Photoshop that you can't do in the darkroom. So we were really limited to just color correction, burning and dodging, and basic exposure. And that's pretty much how I have continued my practice with journalism. Now, as the years have gotten on, especially some of what I like to call the softer sections or the feature sections, you certainly are seeing a little bit more manipulation in post-production or with film or with illustration. But I've mainly kept my toning, and that's I guess what the photojournalist term is, toning, to a minimum. And then in terms of manipulating your subjects, there is still a pretty hard and fast rule that you're not supposed to you're not supposed to tell anybody to do anything unless it's a portrait, and then you have to label it as a portrait in the caption so they know that there might be some potential direction that the photographer gave.
Good to know. Tell us about this Lincoln's project.
Yeah, so this was a story that I pitched to Time Magazine that they happily picked up. I believe this was taken in 2018. So this is the Association of Lincoln Presenters, and it's a bunch of Lincoln lookalikes and their wives who meet every year in a different Civil War era location, and they spend the weekend discussing how to be a better Lincoln. Most of them present to high schools, middle schools, and associations around the country. And there's a couple Hollywood Lincolns in here too. So the whole weekend they basically get into character, and they go along and they tour different Civil War sites. They interact with whatever public we're in. We were in a very small town in Georgia for this. So imagine, 40 Lincolns walking down the street of a small town in Georgia, causes quite the scene. So I spent the weekend with them, photographing this project, and yeah, it was great. It was a lot of fun. There were some rules that I do. I couldn't drink, I couldn't curse. I had to kind of act like a Lincoln for the weekend as well. But it was a lovely opportunity to photograph a really, really, really unique community.
What do you mean you had to act like a Lincoln for the weekend?
So they had the rules there. So, Abraham Lincoln didn't drink, he didn't curse. So, everybody who attended the conference, whether you were of the press or an actual presenter, a Lincoln presenter, you sort of had to sign a contract to adhere by the laws of the former president, I guess is the best way to say it.
Wow, that's awesome. And you were just like in bed with them for the entire weekend, huh?
Yes, I did. The only very funny request they asked me was to hide my tattoos, which I initially pushed back on, but then I was like, let's just make this smooth. So that was the only thing, because I guess I know tattoos were around, but Mr. Lincoln certainly did not have any. So,
and who gave you that stipulation?
It was so every year they rotate which Lincoln is in charge of it. So the gentleman who was in charge of it this year, Earl and Martha, I forget their last name. They were an Abraham and Mary Lincoln combo. He set the rules for the weekend. Yeah.
Very cool. So it'd be good to chat for a minute about this, pitch to time for this project. Just give us the kind of bullet points on how that all went down.
Yeah, this is great. It's a great example of a good pitch. So this was one where I had found out about these Lincoln Presenter weekends about 6 months before the next one was going to happen. So maybe about 3 months before this conference, I reached out to the organizers of the Lincoln Conference. I introduced myself. I sent them a very long email introducing who I am and what my intentions were. I got on the phone with them, and they've had some press before, so they kind of knew what I was looking for, but they granted me access. And then I went to Time Magazine, photo editor at the time, who was there, and I pitched in this story. I said, hey, look, I have access. I have my flights ready to go. I have an idea of what I want to do. All I need is a green light. So I kind of just set it up for them to say yes or no. And they were happy to oblige. But their only stipulation was that I had to write a 1,000-word article and turn the pictures in within 24 hours of the weekend being wrapped. So it was a very, very intense post-production 24 hours.
Yeah. How did your photojournalism training background set you up for writing?
What helped the most was by having so much experience listening to other reporters interview subjects. That was by far the most valuable thing I gained. So this was one of the first times I'd ever written a story in addition to photographing the story. So I knew it was a matter of interviewing the right people, getting help with the transcription very quickly because of the turnaround. And then, because this is a feature story, this is not an investigation. There's not a lot of research I had to do on the subject matter. It was more just about a community of people who live a very unique kind of second life. So it was mostly just chatting with them about why they feel like they want to dress up as Abraham Lincoln every weekend. And it was some very unique stories. It was really interesting.
And even though writing is probably not, in your list of things that you might want to do, it's probably cool to have this as a case study with a full 360 from the pitch to the photography to the writing.
Yes,
for the final published work as well.
Exactly. And like I said, Brian, especially like having pitched it myself, I really cared about this project. So it was really nice to be able to contribute the writing as well as the photographs. It was a great opportunity.
Yeah, that's phenomenal.
There's a good question in the chat about post-production.
Sure.
Adam Wells was curious about the photographing at the bar on your birthday and being able to stay there after you delivered the images. He's curious, how many images do you shoot versus deliver? And how much time do you spend on toning prior to delivering?
That's a great question.
How did you do that in the bar?
It's funny. I actually so it was my birthday that day. So I walked away from the bar and I walked into a White Castle. It was my first time having White Castle ever. And I turned in the pictures from a table in a White Castle, having my first White Castle burger. But in general, and this has not really changed over the years, but on a story like that, I probably spent about 6 hours on location photographing. I probably shot upwards of 1,000 photographs. I cut that down to, I want to say, between 20 and 40 photographs. And from there, it's very light toning and captioning, pretty much the things I said earlier, burning and dodging, color correction, contrast, stuff like that. Then you have to embed captions with every photograph as well. So that whole process takes, I'm probably faster at it now than I was 10 years ago, but anywhere from 1 to 3 hours to turn the pictures in.
Tell us about this image that makes me dizzy. I've never...
Yes. It made me dizzy too.
On an airplane, but looking through any lens in a vehicle is going to make one sick.
Yeah, this was again a very fun assignment. It was for the Wall Street Journal. The Air Guard aeronautics team was having basically it was a press availability flight. So if you were a member of the press, then they wanted to promote their weekend air show on Long Island. And I was able to, the Wall Street Journal assigned me to go photograph it. They asked me, the first question is, how do I do in multiple G movements? And I said, what's a multiple G movement? And they said, you'll find out. So I went and photographed this. So I am in the, let's see, was I in the front seat or the back seat? I must have been in the front seat for this image. Yeah. But you're very strapped in. So every single photograph I took from the shoot, I'm holding the camera like this behind me and shooting blindly. So I would shoot for a little bit, pull the camera around, and then just kind of adjust my framing from there. I'm happy to say that I made it through 98% of the flight without getting sick until he did one giant loop that he warned me about. And on the way down, I lost my lunch. And they very mercifully, they put a paper bag Velcroed to the side of your seat, just in case you get sick. But the only bummer that I was the first media person to go. So when we landed, all the local TV stations had set up their TV cameras to get B-roll footage of the plane arriving, and as the glass on top pops off, you just see me in the back of the seat, just kind of like this. But the gentleman from the guard thankfully got me into a trailer safely. But I still had to turn the pictures in very quickly, so I had to recover very quickly and turn them in. But it was a fun day.
It's probably another opportunity of people that are looking forward to being photographed.
Yes, yeah. This was just a simple story on the Hofstra basketball coach. And this is one of my favorite images from the student section. I went to New York University, so we didn't really have any sports at our school. But coming from in high school, I was a 3-sport athlete. So anytime I get to photograph sports, I'm very excited to. And I've never been a part of a fan section, so I basically embedded myself with the Hofstra basketball fan section for an evening game.
That's great. Yeah, this one is just, there's so many things that are just pulling my attention here, but the main thing that grabbed me when I first saw this was that lady, like dead center frame, that's just, not paying attention to you, looking past you, but just so pained with what's happening.
Yeah, I believe, if I remember correctly, they were trying to distract the opponent from a free throw. So that's why they were really going nuts in this frame. Oh, yeah. So this is actually the most recent story I shot for the Times that kind of became a bit more of an enterprise story. So the whole area around Penn Station in Manhattan is being rezoned. They basically are calling it a blight. And when the state declares a neighborhood a blight, they are able to basically kick businesses out with no recourse or no reason. So this was a story about capturing sort of the last of the old area around in Penn Station before it got flipped to a nicer neighborhood and a nicer transit port.
Okay. So when the editors came to you with this project, did they give you an kind of overview of how many images they're looking for in order to tell the story?
Sometimes, not. Usually no. And for this one, I think I spent more time in it than they were anticipating. So this turned it from a 1 or 2 picture story into a full slideshow, kind of presentation on the website. This was all shot over the course of about, I want to say 6 hours in one day. So I was able to get a lot of variety and, I was able to take my time. Like the image in the top left, I saw that gentleman taking a nap in the sunlight, and I probably spent 15 or 20 minutes waiting for the pigeons to potentially fly off near him to capture that image. So it's when a feature story like this, when I'm sort of allowed to take my time, I really try to push it as much as I can and deliver more than what the photo editors are expecting.
That's great. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this, looking through your work too, that some of your work looks like it takes a lot of patience to push the shutter release button once. And then other times it's, just firing off and being in the right place at the right time.
100%, exactly. It's usually either one or the other. I'm usually either waiting around for up to an hour for the frame to come to me, or I have 1 second to capture the frame. Let's see. This one, actually, this was the second to last major project I did for the Times. They were trying to figure out a way how to visualize the return of subway ridership and the difference between how busy different neighborhoods would, or how often certain neighborhoods would start using the subway again. So they gave me about 12 days to shoot stills and time lapses of 4 major stations in the city that they thought embodied the kind of the various socioeconomic classes of the city. So these images all happen to be from a Queens station. This was a neighborhood full of mostly working class New Yorkers, so folks who couldn't do remote work basically. So this station came back right away after COVID. So I spent about 3 days at each station making stills and major time lapses as well.
Very cool.
So I've had an opportunity to do some celebrity work for the New York Times. A lot of it's last minute stuff, but I always relish the opportunity to shoot, more fashion and celebrity. And when I was in my early 20s, I was assigned to shoot a lot of fashion week parties, basically stuff that happens between midnight and 6 a.m. Shoots that I might not want to do nowadays, 10 or 15 years later. But the top left image is of Janelle Monáe, a famous singer outside of the Met Gala. So that's a Met Gala photo. Top right is of a Betsy Johnson runway show. It was one of her last shows before she retired. And then the bottom left one was actually taken in my studio where I'm talking to you guys right now. We have a fire escape in the Flatiron District. And anytime I have a celebrity come into my studio, I take them to the fire escape for a photograph. So Aubrey Plaza walked through my studio while a full video shoot was happening. I asked her if she wouldn't mind just keeping it down for the video shoot. And she walked in. There was a piano in the middle of our studio, and she just kind of did this to, kind of play around to mess with everybody. But besides that, she was very sweet to work with. And then the bottom right is Jason Bateman from the various shows. And the bottom right was a press run. So that was in a hotel conference room that I had about 4 minutes with him, I would say, when he walked in.
That's great. So for this press run, did you photograph others in that same setup?
No, he was the only one on that day. Yeah. Yes.
And then LD,
one of my favorite shoots ever. This was taken on a Super Bowl Sunday. I forget which year, a couple of years ago. It's important to say that because he walks in the door. We were supposed to meet at 1 o'clock. I had 15 minutes with him from the time he walked in the door to not. And I introduced myself. I said, "Hi, I'm Ben Norman. I'm with the New York Times. Thank you so much for meeting with me, Larry." And he said, "Well, thanks so much. How long is this going to take?" And I was like, "Larry, your publicist said we have 15 minutes, and now we have 13 minutes, so you'll be out of here in 13 minutes. And he was like, "I just want to make sure I'll be home in time for the Super Bowl." And I was like, "Larry, that's in 5 hours. You'll be totally fine." He's like, just make sure I'm home for the Super Bowl. And I was like, "You got it, sir. Let's do this." But this was a shoot where I was given about 2 or 3 days notice, but I had to find my own location. And there wasn't an extra fee for a celebrity, so I had to walk around. He grew up in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, I believe. Not Bensonhurst, a neighborhood deep in Brooklyn. But this was a diner in his where he grew up. So I walked in, met the manager of the diner, told him what I wanted to do. As soon as he heard the Larry David name, he was like, "You can take the corner booth." And I photographed him for maybe only 7 or 8 minutes before the crowd got a little out of control. So it's very quick.
That's great. What is it called? Kuro's Bay, it looks like, something like that, the restaurant?
Yeah, it was just like kind of a standard Brooklyn diner. I wish I remember what neighborhood it was in. It's a neighborhood very, very deep in Brooklyn.
Very cool. Yeah, that's great. And the crowd and something like this, let me start back. Did Larry David have anyone with him?
Publicist? Yeah, he brought in a publicist, and he actually brought his daughter, who were both very friendly. And he actually spoke with the reporter. He had lunch with the reporter in the diner beforehand, I think in the same booth. And we purposely posed Larry away from the front entrance so nobody could really recognize him. But he does have a pretty famous profile, I guess. So
yeah. And
there's a question in the chat about this. Did you have a crew with you, and did you bring any lighting? And I guess do you do any lighting on any of these?
Yeah, I do lighting. Some of the celebrity work on the previous page, Janelle and Jason Bateman were lit. The top left and bottom right were lit. You can see the lighting on the bottom right. It's just a beauty dish with the sock on top of it. The top left image was also taken with the beauty dish, but I had an assistant holding it on a monopod. And then for the Larry David shoot, I did bring an assistant with a monopod and about a 3-foot umbrella. But this was just natural window light. But I did have an assistant to kind of crowd control. But it didn't. I probably needed a whole team to crowd control, honestly. So it was very, very quick. But this one was unlit. This was just window lighting.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the window lighting works better here. It seems more personal, and you guys are just two buds hanging out versus a staged portrait.
Yeah, agreed.
I read from it. Very cool. So this is some of the your higher paid commercial projects. But let's talk about this project and how this work fits in line with the previous projects you worked on.
Yeah, so what I've noticed when I started getting hired for commercial work was that I was getting hired for gigs where I had to the subject were non-celebrities. They were real everyday people. And they were usually folks that didn't have a lot of time to be photographed. So I had to get in, make them very comfortable very quickly, and get out. So this is for a local health insurance company or a home health aid service called the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. And I worked with them for almost 10 years shooting their ad campaigns of real New Yorkers. So these are actual patients or clients of the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. I would have no time to scout these photographs. I would have to walk in, and usually the 2-hour clock would start as soon as I walked in the door. I had to introduce myself, sometimes through a translator, and photograph these people. The whole ad campaign was living well at home. So all the images were kind of based around that theme.
And this is some work you've done as unit stills, like on set with video or motion productions, right?
Yeah, and this was the same thing. I've very often noticed that I get hired for unit stills because I can work very quickly, in between shots or while the video crew is flipping the set or something like that. So these were all taken on video sets where I either am shooting in tandem with the video crew with a limp or a silent shutter, or I am given only a couple minutes in between shots to capture some still content. And it's a total mix of celebrities and real people on the unit stills.
And for projects like this, who are you generally being hired by? Is it the brand client, or is it the producer of the production?
It's like 95% the production company who's handling the video as well. And it's usually a request from the client to add still. Usually the stills are, I hate to say it, but an afterthought. So they want somebody who can come in very quickly to capture content. Yeah. But it's almost always production companies. Yeah, so I do a little bit of studio work as well. I'm talking to you guys from a studio space that I work out of in the Flatiron district of Manhattan. And any opportunity I get to control the light and be inside and have access to a bathroom and water and stuff like that, which is very rare for a photojournalist, I take the opportunity to do it. So these are some local acting company. The gentleman on the left and the gentleman in the middle are young and up-and-coming actors in the city. And the gentleman on the right is a semi-well-known art director for a local company who wanted his portrait taken.
So yes, we're kind of getting a little low on time here, but I think this is important to talk about this Wall Street project, especially as you're painting it as your, a good personal project that launched your career. You want to walk us through this one?
Yeah, so while you're flipping through, I'll just tell you what happened. These were taken my senior year of college. I was in the only photo class I ever took was a documentary photography class. I was an economics major who had interned at a Wall Street firm my junior year of college before I knew what I wanted to do. So my photo teacher looked at me and said, "Ben, go shoot what you know." And it was the economic recession was just happening in 2008. I was an economics major. I just finished working at an investment bank. So I spent a semester, about 4 months down on Wall Street, a couple of days a week, taking images of that. I think it's a 1/4-mile stretch, the whole block. So that's where these images came from. There was a lot of me waiting around for moments to happen, for scenes to line up. But it was a perfect segue to launch my career because it was the hot, the recession of 2008. I'm sure we all remembered on this call. It was the news of the year, and a lot of magazines and newspapers needed images to support the articles and the opinion pieces about the recession. So these images got picked up pretty quickly. I got very lucky with these, but it was right place, right timing, really.
Well, I don't know. I'm going to disagree with you. I think this one is some good foreshadowing and shadowing, like this guy and the shadow of some other person walking, just mirroring each other. Like this is I see this common thread through a lot of your work with this enigmatic lighting and we've talked about this. There's a tongue-in-cheek sense of humor in your work as well.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the best pieces I ever got from one of my former mentors was if you miss a scene, if you wait around long enough, it's going to happen again. And this photo is a perfect example of that. Where I saw the shadow, I missed it, and I sat there. I think that guy smoked 2 or 3 cigarettes, so maybe 15 minutes, waited for the shadows to line up again.
Phenomenal. And I love these 3 dudes just staring you down.
Yeah, this is one of the first times I got cursed at as a photographer in New York, and kind of threatened a little bit, but it built my second skin up, built my New York City tough skin up. So yes, he was politely telling me to get lost. I would say the gentleman on the right. Yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of scenes like this during the recession, 2008, 2009. It was quite the scene down there, a mix of tourists and locals and folks who've just been laid off, protesters. It was quite the circus down there.
Have you re-edited these images since you photographed them? Because I'm going to say, like, this is pretty impressive for the tones are impressive for a college kid, I think.
Thank you. It's funny, I haven't, and almost all my work since then has been color. I think this was just a right opportunity. Wall Street's very gray. In general, the buildings are gray and beige, but then you have folks wearing red, orange, yellow hats. So I knew I wanted to do it black and white pretty quickly. I was also influenced by my professor, who was a black and white photographer. But, I was lucky. All I had to do, I was in college still, so all I had to do was tone these images all day. So I got a lot of time.
And how did you get access to the stockroom floor on that last one?
So that one was actually, I piggybacked that off of a Wall Street Journal assignment where they sent me to shoot a stock ticker in the exchange, but it just happened to be the day that the US's credit rating was downgraded. So it turned into quite a circus on the floor of the exchange. So I was able to piggyback that onto my onto this personal project.
Very cool. These guys look like you don't know whether they're going to curse at you or enjoy getting their photos made.
Yeah, there's a very quick funny story about this one. The gentleman on the right, I ran into about 4 months after I took this image, and I saw him on the street. I was like, hey, I actually have a photo of you. Can I show it to you? I showed it to him. I was a little nervous that he would think I was, typecasting him like as in a Wall Street movie, but he loved this image so much. He purchased a 24 by 36 limited edition print to put on his wall because he just got promoted in his firm. So certainly wasn't bucking the stereotype of a Wall Street banker. That's for sure.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, beginning of Occupy, this photo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is probably the most well-known one from the series. This is the one that really got around to the photo editors and stuff like that. It's very Patrick Bateman looking haircut.
Yeah, I'm just wondering so much, like, in this, like that, wherever you're at in this lens was at f4.5 or 5.6 or something, and seeing the pattern in his hair and the tooth in his jacket, and then that, blurry bokeh up pattern going on in the buildings in the background. It's very smart, Ben. Very smart.
Thank you.
So yeah, as I mentioned, and Ben, you can talk about it much better than I did, but you're I'd like to hear you talk about the Trump arraignment.
Yeah, so this was the biggest news story of the year so far in New York City. I found out afterwards that this was the biggest media gathering since 9/11 of the New York City press. So the New York Times hired 8 photographers to photograph Trump's arraignment. They had 2 photographers outside of Trump Tower, and they had 5 of us right outside of Manhattan Criminal Court. And our singular task was to get as many images of Trump as we could throughout the day. I was one of the 2 photographers assigned down in Manhattan Criminal Court to stay outside to capture him arriving. So this Google Map image is the circles are the 3 potential entrances to Manhattan Criminal Court. So a big part of this day was a kind of a waiting game. What entrance is going to come in? What are we going to have access to see it? So this job involved a lot of prep, a lot of last minute prep, to be honest, and then a lot of hurry up and waiting. So we ended up going out. If we look on the screen, the bottom center circle was the actual entrance he came in. That whole street was blocked off, and the street behind it was blocked off. Center Street, which is the front entrance, was also mostly blocked off. So I was across the street on the southeast corner of Collect Pond Park. Then that's where I made my image of the day.
You were right around here?
Literally right there, exactly. Yep.
Very cool. And one thing when Ben and I started talking about this, or I think right after this happened, I've written down your quote was, it was a full test of all your photojournalism abilities, no doubt.
Yes. Yeah, it really was. Starting the night before, we had to go down there and scout locations, as you see right here. So this is tape marks that I marked on the street for myself and my colleagues. So not only did we have to pre-visualize the entrance, we had to fight with every other news organization on the planet for access. Some of them had been down there for weeks beforehand. So after taping these up, me and my colleagues literally went to Home Depot, bought a bunch of 8-foot ladders and bike locks, and went back down to the location about 10 o'clock the night before. And we bike locked our ladders to our positions so that we wouldn't lose them the next day. Because technically the street was open to the public. So we knew there'd be a lot of members of the press and the public there to watch kind of the spectacle. There was also a rally happening. Marjorie Taylor Greene was holding a rally in that park where we all were. So there was going to be a lot of protesters. And here my day started at 4 a.m. So me and another photographer got there a little bit after 4. And on a breaking news day like this, you have to file images as often as possible. So by 4:30, the image on the left was the first image I filed. I think by 6 a.m. I had filed, let's say 20 or 30 images. I think total I filed about 70 or 80 that day. And it's not that kind of situation where you have time to sit on your laptop and edit. So I was using you can kind of buy them in the App Store, but it's these SD to Lightning adapters that you plug into your phone. And the Times is a proprietary app to send your photos in from your SD card or from Lightroom Mobile directly to this FTP server. So there were images that I shot that were up on the homepage within 90 seconds of me shooting them. It was really, really, really fast.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is a lot of the spectacle. So all these photos are me sitting on my ladder, just waiting for the arrival to happen. Just like all politics these days, you're going to find a lot of different types of folks will come and see what the ruckus is about. So this is just some placeholder images as I was waiting for Trump's arrival.
So as we're talking about this, you may have mentioned briefly, but how long before this day did you know that you were going to be one of these photographers?
So this was a Tuesday. I got the call on a Saturday. And then on Monday afternoon, they asked me to go down and scout and place the tape and prep, basically. So it was some of the most advanced warning I've ever gotten.
And in that too, you mentioned there was a number of photographers at the criminal court and some at the helipad. How did you guys discuss who was going to be where at the criminal court?
So that was predetermined by the editors. They had two of the 5 down in criminal court were able to go inside, and they were basically the photographers that have been covering Trump the longest and been covering the arraignment the longest. So they were very familiar with the location, and they basically hired me and another photojournalist who's about my level of experience, 15 years of covering New York City, to cover outside, because it was very unpredictable. We weren't sure, how much access we would have, how much space we would have. So, but it was a very senior crew for sure that day. It's people who have been working in New York City for a long time.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that it was all freelancers, right? The only NYT staff member was in Florida.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So Todd Heisler was in Florida covering Trump had a rally directly. He left the arraignment, got on a plane, went back to Mar-a-Lago and had a rally. They had their staff photographer there, but everything else was freelance. Yeah, this is the Marjorie Taylor Greene arriving. You can't see her, and that's for a reason, because she's not very tall, but also the amount of media there was pretty intense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is across the street from where I took my photograph. My colleague, Kirsten Lewis, is in the left photo with the 70-200 to her eye. She's kind of dead center there. So her and I were across the street, looking down the street of where he was going to arrive.
And at this point, did you guys have any notice if any were going to be allowed inside the courthouse?
We did. The 2 photographers who were allowed inside the courthouse had peeled off at about about half an hour before the left image was taken. And then they went radio silent because they had so much negotiating to do inside. And so it came down to just Kirsten and I, making sure the outside was covered.
You were telling me some good stories about that negotiating.
Yeah, so inside it was really unique. So the court and Trump's lawyers basically allowed 5 pool photographers in the courtroom. The pool, for those of you that don't know, are selected by either the media themselves or the courthouse to shoot images inside the courtroom, but you give up your copyright to the images if you're the pool photographer. So basically, 5 photographers were allowed inside the courtroom for exactly 61 seconds to take images of Trump in the courtroom, and then they had to hand over their memory cards to every other member of every other media organization that wanted them. And that's how they shared. That's what pooling the images means. So, and there was also a very intense negotiation for the pool. It was self-negotiated between the media organizations. So it came down to the 5 slots came down to the first 2 slots were for the media organizations that have been covering the arraignment the longest, and that happened to be the New York Post and the Daily Mail. And then the last 3 locations were ultimately given to the 3 major wires: the AP, Getty, and Reuters. But even so, they all lost copyright to their images. So it was all, those 5 photographers' images, they spread everywhere and they were almost on every front page in the world, but there was no copyright. You lose your copyright if you shoot the pool. So it was a pretty unique situation. Yes, that's me. That's me encircled in the red circle. I was using a 100-400 lens. I think I was at f8 or 11 for the image we're about to see. At the very last minute, you can see a woman in front of me. She's got black ladder. Yeah, her. She hopped up on her ladder about 30 seconds before Trump arrived. So I was shooting like this, kind of blinded at a 400 millimeter lens, at a 400 millimeter focal length, halfway down the block. And you can see sort of the photo on the right is me straining to look at my LCD screen.
Yeah, it looks like she just perched a knee up on this barricade.
Exactly. Yep.
Oh, I love it. So this was found online, it looks like, by the Washington Post.
Eris Ride, a lovely local photographer who was on assignment for the Washington Post, filed this. Yeah.
And for what it's worth, this is your assistant on some jobs as well.
Yes, it is. Yeah, Jack, he was holding down. That was one of the ladders that we could place the night before. He was standing on top of it, but it just didn't have enough of a view of the street for me to use it. So he ended up holding it down and using it for his own work. Yeah, so this is the image that ran, or this is the uncropped version of the image that ran. I believe the settings was like f811, ISO 1600 or 3200 at 400 millimeters. So very high ISO, very high aperture. I knew yeah, that's the actual photo. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus once he got out of the car, so I pre-focused when the first Secret Service car pulled up. I pre-focused my camera on that, turned the autofocus off. And then as soon as he got out of the car, I motor drive the photograph. And I got very lucky with this opportunity to make an image that looked like he was going, kind of in a jail cell. So it worked out really well, but it was a very, very lucky image to get. I really was on my tippy toes, holding my arms up as high as I could with a 400 millimeter lens to get this image. It was very difficult.
Yeah. So if I have this correct, your entire job of the day was to get a photo of Trump.
Yes, that's it.
About 9 hours of you just holding your spot in order to get this, physically holding your spot in order to get this photo of Trump.
Exactly.
And then, probably had this was taken over like maybe 10 seconds of time, etc.
Yeah, I think he's in about 5 frames. And he was outside for, I think 10 seconds is about right. From the time he literally physically left the car to enter the building, it was maybe 10 seconds.
Yeah. It's still so, I'm being complimentary here, but it's very remarkable that you can have this very editorialized photo behind the bars. He's got that side light, backlight going on from the police lights that you love, that appears in a lot of your work. Not center of frame, with blurry people in the foreground. It's very Ben Norman photo that, that you definitely took the time to scout and wait for. Yeah,
absolutely. No, thank you. Yeah. I mean, it was almost, let's say, 24 hours of prep for 10 seconds of shooting, really, truly. And then I had to get the image in right away. So I think I told you, Brian, but I had to, as soon as the image was taken, I tried to upload the photo. I was surrounded by thousands of people. It was really hard to get it. So I had to kind of, let's call it a hard jog about 2 blocks away to get internet access. And I actually got I'm actually remembering this now. The only way I got the photo in was that there was an NYU dorm nearby that my phone could still connect to the NYU Wi-Fi. So that's how I was able to upload the photograph. Otherwise, I probably would have been in trouble. Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you mentioned that the delay in the upload caused one of your colleagues to have a photo of Trump up there before you.
Yes, my colleague Kirsten, who was across the street, she got her photo in well before me. I think she's very, very, very good. I think it was luck of the network draw. And she had a much cleaner, much less editorialized photo of him leaving or entering the courthouse. Sorry. So I think in the end of it, it was the more appropriate photo to run first. But the Times did end up using that photo in a couple different places.
Yeah. So that's him entering the courthouse. And then he's inside the courthouse. And which was all what I think you mentioned, it was 5 pool photographers. Is that right?
There were 5 pool photographers in the courthouse, and then there were another 10 or 15 in the hallway just outside of the courthouse to capture another image of him.
And one of those hallways was a New York Times photographer as well?
Yeah, so he was supposed to be a part of the pool, but once the negotiations finished with the pool, and it basically came down to either the Times or the Post, and everybody thought it was more appropriate to have a wire service there as the last photographer, just so not choosing between 2 major papers, and any newspaper can access the wires anyway. So one of my colleagues was in the hallway, who was actually shot Trump at almost the exact same settings I shot. High ISO, 400 millimeters. He only had about 5 or 10 seconds to make the photo, and also had to get it in as quickly as humanly possible. I think I saw him sprinting outside the building to get network service as well. So there was a lot of physical running around that day to turn the pictures in.
Wild. So then, as I understand it, you were letting me know that he's in the courthouse for a bit, and then one of the goals was to try to get him exiting the courthouse.
Yeah, I did. So actually, at that point, I knew I had lost my spot of where I got him initially. So I went around to the back of the building, and from about 2 blocks away. So I had a 100 to, I think it was a 100 to 400 zoom lens on. I put on a 2x extender, so I was at almost 1,000 millimeters, shooting through 2 fences to get him coming out, but. I think Secret Service had either gotten smart about where the photographers are, but they had completely blocked visual access to him leaving the courthouse. So nobody got a photo of him leaving at all. The next photo we see of him is when he's back at Mar-a-Lago.
Did Jack take these of you?
Yes, my Jack took these photos of me. This is classic Tri-X 400 too, which I'm so happy to have. I was telling my wife last night, she hadn't seen the photo on the right, but 90% of my photojournalism career is spent turning in pictures on the sidewalks of New York City. So that's a very appropriate photograph.
So then Trump exits the courthouse. No one's able to get a photo of him. What's the next step? What do you do from there?
So for me,
you've been there for what now, 10 plus hours?
Yeah, it was about, I would say that's about hour 11 or 12 when he left. I think he entered at 1:23 and left at about 3 something, maybe a little before or after 3. So the rest of my job, once his motorcade left my location, was to do what I did on the right, sit down, look at all the images that I'd taken that day, refile anything that needed extra captions, or if anything I missed, would turn in more pictures. And then I wrapped up at about 4:30 or so. I went to go collect the ladder that I had bought for the shop for the job beforehand. And me and my colleagues who were down there, we actually all had ladders on us. It was actually a pretty funny scene to see 5 or 6 photographers all holding 8-foot ladders, walking to an Irish pub around the corner to get a beverage after the day. Because it was a very, very, very long day. I think I woke up at 2 a.m. the day before, or day of. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for going through this.
Of course, thank you.
Did you pack lots of snacks and things for that day? Did you have snacks inside your 400 millimeter lens?
I didn't pack a lot of snacks because I knew I couldn't use the bathroom a lot. I actually kind of starved and dehydrated myself just to make sure I didn't have to go at the wrong time, basically. There was no public bathrooms that day. We all ended up using, I think there was a bodega about 3 blocks away where if you gave them $1, you could use their bathroom in the back. But there was a line. I used it once at 7 a.m. and there was already a line out the door for the bathroom. So I was like, okay, time to shut it down and just suffer a little bit to get the shot.
So going into some general photojournalism and assignment questions, Ben. In the planning, what are some of the main questions you're asking an editor when they come to you with the project?
Sure. So the first thing is definitely deadline. Deadlines are very can almost be non-existent nowadays because of news is delivered instantaneously on the internet. And the second thing is access. What kind of access do we have? Have there been any intentions set up or any pre-agreed upon access with the subject, whether it's a celebrity or an everyday person? And then, what I don't really talk about is the style of it. I think the Times tries to keep it pretty, they hire you for your style. So they kind of expect you to figure it out and apply your style to the situation or your approach to the situation. But it's almost all logistics, to be honest. Those are my first questions, because that determines what I'm literally able to shoot and if I can apply my style. So it's very logistics heavy.
Yeah. One of the questions that, editorial or commercial photographer asks too is about budget. But in cases like with the Times or these other news journal publications, I imagine that fee is pretty standardized.
Yeah, so there's no such thing, or there's very rarely space rates nowadays. It's all day rates, and that's up to 8 hours of work. The New York Times happens to be $450. It ranges from $275 to $800, I would say, for other newspapers and magazines. And that also can determine on the copyright usage of your images as well. But it's 99% day rates nowadays.
Yeah. So whether they run one Trump photo or 1,000, it's all on the same day rate.
Same thing. Front page, back page, doesn't matter. Yep.
Cool. Then we were talking about hazard pay earlier when we were talking about shooting and scouting through COVID. Do you want to touch on that a little bit for people that might not know?
Yeah, of course. So hazard pay is usually 1.5 or 2x of the day rate. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're in a war zone, but certainly it would apply there. But it's usually in hazardous situations. So for example, when COVID was raging in New York City, we were all given hazard pay for basically from April 1st, 2020 through the end of the year because it was so unknown what we were walking into. And almost all of us got sick from assignment work anyway. So. And
then you mentioned copyrights earlier. How do most publications handle the copyrights with the photographers?
So I would say nowadays, most publications are in a work for hire situation. The New York Times is a little unique where you share copyright with them. So they will syndicate your photographs taken for them either via Redux or their own platform afterwards. But it really depends on if the licensor comes to me or the Times. If the licensor comes to me, I keep 100% of the profits. If the licensor goes to the New York Times, we split 50-50.
And then is there generally an embargo period on some of these press images?
There is. It ranges from 24 hours to 7 or 10 days. That really depends on the publication. But I've rarely run into situations where an embargo has impacted my ability to license a photograph. So it's usually that is mostly a thing of the past. It exists, but it's pretty rare nowadays for it to be an issue, basically.
Cool. So one question that, I think would be good to talk about, is how does a photographer like you stay relevant in a giant city like New York, where, as we saw in those photos of Trump, there's a lot of people out there with cameras.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's the toughest part of the job by far. I feel like every year there's a new group of photojournalists graduate from photojournalism schools and from different photo schools in general, who are always knocking on the photo editor's door. So you don't have to constantly reinvent yourself, but you constantly need to be pushing your product, basically. So for me, that is local news shot in a what I like to call like an elevated, a style where I'm really considering the composition and the background and the focus. And also it's pitching stories. Pitching stories is absolutely the best way to stay relevant. If you can't, I always tell people that photo editors get, especially let's take the New York Times, for example, each photo editor probably gets 50 cold emails a day from up and coming photojournalists or established photojournalists. So what are you going to do to A, make their lives easier, and B, if you want to get into a new publication, how are you going to replace the group of photographers they already have? It is a massive supply and demand imbalance with photojournalism in New York City. So the best way to do it, I've always said, is to pitch stories that are ready to go on a silver platter. So for example, the Lincoln project, that before I even approached Time Magazine, access was granted, my shoot plan was granted, my shoot plan was thought out, my flights were booked, everything was ready to go. It was literally handed to them on a silver platter. And that is by far, I found, the best way to break into different publications, because not only do you look good, you make your photo editor look good when they turn around to their bosses and they're like, hey, I have this wonderful project that's ready to go. All I need is your approval, whoever the head of the section is. So it makes everybody look good. It's really it looks like you're well thought out. And that is by far the best advice I've ever gotten and given, is the pitch to stay relevant. You kind of have to be honest.
Beyond COVID, let's take COVID out of it a little bit. What are like the biggest like ebb and flows of your career? The peaks and valleys, the ups and downs.
Yeah, COVID was definitely one. There was a period in 2017 when the New York Times was doing a lot of 360 virtual reality stuff. Samsung had a contract with the New York Times to push their 360 cameras, so I ended up doing a lot of those projects that were really fun. I was able to travel around the country for the first time for the New York Times, but I didn't take a still image for them for almost 6 months or a year. Yeah. So when I got back, and those are everybody's sectioned at the New York Times. Video's one department, photos the other. So photo didn't hear from me for 6 months or a year. Somebody was receiving the phone calls I used to get from the photo department. So for me to come back in was very, 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 very difficult. Yeah. And then even last year, I two of my major commercial clients, they retired. So, I had these 8-year visiting nurse service was one where I worked for them for 8 years straight, and they just simply retired. They hired a new ad agency. The ad agency had to justify their existence, basically. So they wanted to bring on a new photographer, somebody that was just happened to be different. So last year was also a bit of a valley, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be good to open up the chat to the questions to the audience here and see what anyone else has.
I'm gonna go ahead and start with one. Ben, where do you tend to find your story ideas? Like where does somebody find the story about the Lincoln weekend?
Great question. It's almost all stuff like that is those more like cultural second life stuff is all the internet, social media. I think I came across it on Instagram. But where I get all my stories in New York City are from talking to people. I've tried to use the internet. I've tried to use social media. It helps a little bit, but all the major stories in my life I've gotten is just by happen to be just being very inquisitive about my fellow New Yorker. I've gotten story ideas from bodega owners. I've gotten stories from police officers. I've gotten stories from my upstairs neighbors. One of the biggest stories I got was from an ex's friend over COVID, who just happened to think of a good idea. So it's really just being very inquisitive to my community, basically, or my city, really. That's where the best ones come from.
Tegra, do you want to go ahead and shout out your question? You can turn your camera on and your mic on.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Ben. Amazing work.
Thank you.
So I have shot for the New York Times in the past few years and mostly do travel stories, more local, and I'm in Washington State.
Cool.
And I love it, and I really want to do more work for them. How do you recommend that I try and break into more of the journalism side?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I really think what I would do is I would find local pitches to Washington State that will be relevant to either the national section, political section, arts and leisure styles. I would find pitches or find stories that you could pitch to the individual sections. And if you are able to prep the pitch in a way where it's kind of ready to go, like I said, I would approach the editor that you've worked with, the travel editor, and be like, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Editor, I have this great idea for politics or a great idea for national. It's ready to go. Would you mind connecting me with that editor? And they will be much more willing to do that if your pitch is ready, is already, in progress at the very least, if not, done and ready to go. And I'm not saying you don't have to shoot any images beforehand for the pitch or for the story, but having access granted, again, all the stuff ready to go for them, they will happily pass you along to the other sections. That's how I got embedded with all the other sections, was I just asked my current contact at the Times to connect me with another editor.
Okay, cool. That's what I was thinking. Thank you.
Absolutely. Very doable, for sure. Thank you.
Ben, with the silver platter idea, do you tend to end up writing those, or will they find a writer if they like the project enough?
Usually they'll find a writer. I've only written a couple stories for them, and it's only because I was the only one there, basically. But for most stories, they'll find a writer to pair you up. But I mean, in New York City, they'll definitely find a writer. For Tegra, for example, they might ask her to write it as well, since might not be as many freelance reporters that they're familiar with in Washington State. But if you're doing a story in New York City, they're almost always going to send their own reporter.
I have one last question, Ben. You mentioned earlier the marathon was kind of your favorite day in New York City. Do you have any dream assignments or dream jobs that you have not done yet?
Have I never done that? I really want. This is kind of funny, and but I've always wanted to cover the Westminster Dog Show. I don't even have a dog, but I know it's such a fun, unique day, and I think my style would apply really well to it. I think I've pitched the Times every year on it, and they're always like, "We're good. We know you really want to shoot dogs, man. Thank you." Beyond that, though, I've never really had an interest in covering national politics, so I'm not really into that. And I guess my best answer would be, I'm from New Jersey, and there's such little long form documentary work on New Jersey. I think it'd be really unique to do a deep dive into my home state, the Garden State. I don't know if you guys saw, but Henri Cartier-Bresson's last photo story was on New Jersey, and I've been thinking about that ever since I saw it. I think earlier this year, last year. So if the Times would let me loose on my home state for a couple months, I think that would be a dream assignment.
We've got a question popped up in the chat from Adam Wells. Adam, do you want to go ahead and ask your question yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi.
Hey.
I've been over here just saying wow to myself for most of this chat. I know it's been silent. You guys have been doing a great job moderating, but it's been really insightful. So thanks so much for sharing everything.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it seems really tricky to commit to a story, and I understand like serving it up to an editor, but it sounds like you kind of have to extend yourself and take on some risk in order to bring those things to life. And I was just curious if you could speak to how you kind of hold that tension, and how often you maybe commit to a story and don't have an editor hop on board, or does that happen to you?
It does. I've learned, since going to that Missouri photo workshop in 2016, I've learned to kind of hone my pitching really well. And I can't recommend that workshop enough for everybody. It's only a week long. It's really a life-changing workshop. But I, especially as I get older in my career, my expenses go up. As Brian said, I'm about to be a dad. Personal pitching a project, going out on a limb for an unpaid personal project is sort of becoming a luxury. And I know that not everybody can do it. So what I really do is I really only deep dive in when I have a really good idea that this is going to land somewhere. There's been plenty of stories that I've spent half a day on, making calls, getting access that haven't come to fruition. Or I've just decided after doing a day of research that it's not worth it. So I've just had to be very choosy, and the older I get, I have to be more and more choosy about the stories that I ever really go out on a limb for, because you're not sure if you're going to get paid. At best, you might just recoup your expenses, and it is a significant time suck when I could be doing that for other, for paid jobs, basically. So it's very, very tough, and I've had to screw up a couple of times really to also learn. That's the honest truth as well.
I guess I do have one more follow-up question. Sure. I'm primarily a commercial photographer, but I've done a couple editorial stories. It's challenging for me. I'm very interested in that workshop.
Great.
But yeah, like piecing together editorial day rates seems like a real challenge. I'm curious what percentage of your work is editorial versus commercial, and kind of how you find
great question
there.
That's a great question. So I would say this, that the New York Times is about days on the ground, days actually shooting for them is maybe 60% of my year, but it's only about 20% of my income. Let's say I shoot 100 days for the New York Times. That comes out to 45 grand, I guess. Yeah, for the year, that's a third of my year of 8 to 12 hours of backbreaking work. As a commercial photographer, your commercial rates that maybe would take only a month of shooting commercial to make it that same amount of money in that 100 days. So the most of my year is spent doing photojournalism or documentary work, but it's only about, maybe it's half of my income max, at the absolute max. Yeah. It's really tough, but you gotta love it. But I really think that the editorial work leads to more commercial work. So it's a constant balance of trying. It's just a literal constant balance. Yeah.
And speaking, I know Adam, you and I have talked about this before too. Editorial work, if it's low paying, and it's low paying for, you get access to locations or to talent that you want to photograph. It's low paying, but your name is associated with those images forever, on page or on the internet. And to Ben's point too, it's a great portfolio piece, right? 100%. Clients will say, hey, you had 15 minutes with Larry David, and look what you can do. I would love to have a whole day with you with some money behind you, and what could you do, type thing.
Absolutely. I think the images that we showed earlier of the elderly, New York City's elderly, I think I was specifically hired up by those because they knew that I was able to make work very quickly. That was simply it. I didn't have a portfolio of New York City's elderly before they hired me, but I had a portfolio of Times images of everyday New Yorkers. And I think that went a long way for sure.
Thanks so much, Ben.
Of course. Thank you.
Any last minute questions before we wrap this up?
So one of the people I was talking to yesterday in New York that I was explaining earlier, Ben, was a guy named Paul Melcher, who's sort of like a photo industry advisor.
Okay.
And he advises World Press Photo, cool, among other organizations, and he expressed some frustration with the idea that the photojournalism has historically been focused on encouraging photojournalists to do long form picture stories, but the reality is, over the last 50 years, that there's fewer and fewer places where that exists. I guess in some ways, digital, like online, has actually, like the New York Times does have the real estate to publish multi-picture stories in a way that they can't in the physical paper. So maybe it's a two-part question. One part is, are you seeing the Times and other newspapers and other publications sort of devoting digital real estate to multi-photo stories? And then the second part of the question is, like, do you think that this emphasis on long form journalism is passé? And what Paul was suggesting is, like, World Press Photo should have a category for just like most popular picture of the year, and it maybe the award will go to Kim Kardashian, but maybe that's what we need, is to also sort of just recognize pictures that are impactful. I mean, clearly, if a picture gets shared 10 million times, I mean, that's making an impression on a lot of humans.
I think it's a really, really good point. So to your first question about the real estate, over the Times, they oscillate between emphasizing long form projects and not, and it really depends on the section. So, the story on the subway recovery, for example, that I did for the Metro section of the Times took me, almost a month or two. But this year they've been covering much more breaking news. So I think the Times does have a particular luxury of having a very well-designed, very laid out website where folks are used to kind of scrolling down through these longer form stories. So there's still an opportunity for that. But what I found is that when I started applying to internships and to workshops and to even just to be hired by publications 15 years ago, the portfolio they asked for was 10 singles and then a single story, a longer form story. Nowadays, all they want to see from what I've heard is long form stories. And the reasoning behind that is because if you can go out as a photographer and shoot a project over the course of a week or a month, and you can get very intimate access and you can be very patient with your work, then you should be able to shoot the perp walks or the Kim Kardashian red carpets, for example, that if you basically, it's like, if you can show them you can do the hardest work available, then they can trust you with more with quicker work. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to go about it, but, you know, I'm teaching it at NYU right now. And I've encouraged all my students to do long form projects because, you know, again, if they can go out and follow a restaurant worker for 6 months, they can go and take a mugshot or, you know, a quick press conference photo, basically. But I think you're right. I mean, Nat Geo, right? Every assignment for Nat Geo used to be 6 months to a year. Now it's 3 weeks max, 4 weeks max, if you're very lucky. Sometimes they're only a week long. So I think it's a bit of an imbalance, or it doesn't really line up, but that's just the current market is still, in my experience, asking to show long form work, even though you might not be hired to do long form work.
Well, thanks everybody for showing up. We really appreciate having a nice audience. And Ben, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'm sure that we will have some more member open houses coming up in the near future.
That's great. Thanks, guys. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ben.